Some aphorisms on how to proceed from a baseline in materialistic modernity. Bruce Charlton. The only valid place from which to proceed is a conscious apprehension of the real self, a direct knowing without words, pictures, symbols, feelings, or logic. Negative learning can never point in a positive direction. Disillusion is only valuable when it leads to reality, not to another illusion. Cynicism causes demotivation, which leads to external control by short-term environmental stimuli. However things may have been in other times and places, there is now an absolute need, and no substitute, for living with conscious purpose in a meaningful reality. The starting point for discovery of meaning is the purpose of everything, which entails recognizing reality as a creation. Our children and what we leave them. Francis Berger. What kind of world will we leave our children? Many proclaim this to be the most pressing question of this time and place. Some counter this question with another. The most pressing question is not what kind of world we will leave our children, but what kind of children we will leave the world. Both miss the mark. The question should be more directed towards the kind of children we will leave for eternity. Yet even that falls short because it neglects to mention that our children will have a tremendous say in whatever we leave them with. We could leave them an ideal world, and they could still seek death. Or we could leave them hell, and they could still seek heaven. Of course, we all long to leave them the best possible world in which to commit to heaven, but the best possible world cannot guarantee that commitment. Nor can the worst possible world. Ultimately, the world we leave them is far less significant than we vehemently assume. Such is the nature of freedom. We must believe that God loves our children even more than we do and will always leave paths to salvation open to them regardless of the world we leave them. And we must believe that our children will recognize these paths and commit to them. Such is the nature of faith. They shall deceive the very elect. William Wildblood. The full quote from Matthew 24 is, "For there shall arise false Christs, and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect." Jesus is talking about the end times. It seems to some that our times are the end times, and even if they are not, they certainly do a good impression of it. It's true that often over the course of history people have thought they were living during the end times, but the widespread apostasy of the present day has not occurred before, nor has the fact that the gospel of the kingdom has indeed been preached in all the world, which Jesus said would be an indication of the approaching end. Be that as it may, the same patterns tend to repeat themselves at similar stages, so while we may or may not be living in the actual end times, teachings relating to that will still be relevant, for no one can deny we are living through some kind of cultural and civilizational breakdown, with the spiritual being chased from the world in most places. Jesus says that even the elect might be deceived by the signs and wonders put out by those serving the dark agenda. Who are the elect? I suggest it is anyone who holds fast to the truth and is not deceived, neither by lies nor by half-truths, which always involve a subtler attack on the psyche. These people remain true for the following reasons: a love of truth, spiritual integrity, and humility. They seek their reward in heaven and are not tempted by earthly riches or reputation. A tall order. We would all like to think we belong among this group, but we should do well to remember that we are tested where we are weakest, and even the elect can fall. We might think we have resisted one illusion, but then we be deceived by something coming from the opposite direction. We may be impervious to some assaults on truth, but still succumb to something that plays on our weaknesses. Right motivation is essential on the spiritual path. It will not protect us from everything. We have to have right discernment too, but it will guide us through many difficulties and enable us to resist many temptations. To be part of the elect is not a glamorous position. Their role is to serve and quite possibly to suffer too, for the suffering of the saints is a kind of expiation for the whole of humanity. They will not be thanked or acclaimed or rewarded. They may even be condemned as their master was, but then the mark of the elect is that they seek only to tread the path of light in truth and love, come what may. If we would join them, we must have that attitude too. The spiritual significance of that holiday feeling. Bruce Charlton. Edited from notes by Arkell for Holiday from his collection of pictures, prose and poetry, The Great Gift, 1977.
Holiday portrays the joy and zest and expansion of awareness that can come with the true spirit of holiday, in which many poetic elements of beauty are mixed together and concentrated into moments of splendor. As we all know, these moments come to us in unpredictable ways, and not always in settings of this sort. We also know that it is unlikely we will be able to repeat the moments just as we would like. We can return to the same place and try to reproduce the same physical situation again, yet nothing will happen. We must therefore cherish such moments and value them deeply. In so doing, we are more likely to extract the content of them, after which we may be blessed by another experience. But if we don't take the trouble to work on the first experience, we can understand that it would be bad for us to get others gratuitously, for this would weaken our ability to generate our own strength and endeavor.
My notes on Arkell's notes. Arkell's simple little picture holiday depicts that kind of opening out of consciousness that may be experienced at the very start of an ideal holiday, when we are in a place of our choice, relieved from work and duties, and with leisure to notice and engage with the simple things of living in this world. The first point is that such experiences should be regarded as significant, worth considering. They are not merely pleasant but temporary hedonic emotional states, with merely physical causes. They ought to be seen as potentially spiritually worthwhile. But Arkell also makes clear that this delightful mental state is not wholly a spiritual end in itself, but ought to be regarded as an experience from which we are supposed to learn. Nor is the holiday mood something that we should seek to repeat and repeat, because this will not work, ultimately because to desire to repeat without change is to fail to learn. Neither should we try to overcome jadedness with one place by seeking novelty from holidaying elsewhere, for the same reason. We can think of all this in terms of Arkell's last sentence, which relates to what God wants from us in this mortal life. He wants that we should, as much as possible, generate our own strength and endeavor. That is, God wants that we should do as much as possible for ourselves, spiritually, metaphysically, with respect to baseline understandings and motivations, rather than passively responding to our surroundings. And similarly that we should do so for our own reasons that come from within. What this means to Arkell is, know and act for reasons derived from our true self, an eternal and potentially divine entity that incarnated into mortal life and survives death, rather than behaving in obedience to others such as to deny primary responsibility, or behaving in response to motivations from that externally constructed false personality which tends to monopolize our internal stream of consciousness. Briefly put, Arkell is encouraging an attitude that seeks to learn from our experiences, rather than an attitude of seeking pleasurable experiences. And that we should strive to understand, and to live, from within, rather than passively to absorb stimuli and be shaped from without. We are too spiritually lazy to feel bored. Berger.
The saying, "The Magyar is much too lazy to be bored," is worth thinking about. Only the most subtle and active animals are capable of boredom. A theme for a great poet would be God's boredom on the seventh day of creation.
The above ranks among my favorite Nietzsche aphorisms, and living in Hungary for nearly a decade has only increased my fondness for it. I suppose it has much to do with my Hungarian cultural background, not my ethnic background, though, which is German, but Nietzsche was also German, so there is that. Although the average Hungarian is far too lazy to be bored, I have never thought of God as lazy. Quite the opposite. I believe God remained active even on the seventh day, albeit in a subtle way. Still, I can't shake the feeling that God is capable of boredom, at least when it comes to man. He is waiting for us to answer his call to creativity, and I can't help but imagine the ennui he experiences when we provide him with anything and everything but an answer to that call. We are too spiritually lazy to feel bored. Now that is worth thinking about. It could also serve as theme for a great poet. Why is heaven postponed? Bruce Charlton. Why is heaven postponed? Why should we be made to wait? Why can't we have heaven now, whether here on earth, or elsewhere? Why are we compelled to go through all this mucking about in mortal life? This is, and perhaps always has been, the most powerful question for those who believe in a good God. And it is a killer question for those who believe in an omni-God. If God really is all-powerful and also really is good, then why must we wait, when we could have it now? Self-identified Christians are afflicted as strongly as anyone else. In the time of Jesus it seems that most people did not want what he offered. They instead wanted Jesus to be the Messiah. In other words, they wanted a better mortal life now, more than they wanted resurrected everlasting life. Or else they did not really believe Jesus' promise of eternal joy beyond death. Or maybe they demanded both, paradise on earth now, or ASAP, and after death then eternal resurrected life in heaven. The killer question for Christianity is, why can't people have what they most want? The official compromise answer was that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, but heaven on earth must wait until after his second coming. But this compromise doesn't work at all well. The killer question still stands, why must we wait, if Jesus is God, and God is omnipotent? Why, if he really is omnipotent, didn't Jesus finish his work in the first coming? Why, if he is really good, does Jesus allow, indeed actually cause, because as omni-God he is omnipotent, and created absolutely everything, even the very worst the sufferings of mortal life? Why do this when, apparently, he could give us heaven now? And if a wholly good God allows/actively causes all the nasty stuff he does in this mortal life, then is this really a definition of a good God that we would really want for ourselves? How could we have faith in and trust and love such a God with such incomprehensible, and apparently evil understandings of good? It has the same for most Christians for the past 2,000 years and continuing. What these Christians really want is a better world now, rather than heaven later. For example, they want their church to become powerful enough to impose a better world now. Indeed, many Christians believe that one or another Christian church did indeed impose a better world in some times and places, and regard this as a primary justification for Christianity. But if then, why not now? Or, such church Christians believe that Christians are better people now, than not Christians. Or, at least, they believe their affiliated churches kind of Christians are better people. They believe this despite that better people now wasn't what Jesus promised, any more than he promised a better world now. Because of its implicit determination to put this world first, in a context of asserting an omni-God, historical Christianity really has painted itself into a corner, and from here it is clear that messing around with incomprehensibly complex abstractions does not convince people anymore, if ever it really did convince, rather than compel obedience. There are two answers. The first is to be clear that Jesus' kingdom is, as he repeatedly said in many ways, not of this world. Jesus promised us eternal resurrected life after death in heaven, and if that is not what you want above all, then maybe you aren't really a Christian. Secondly, we need to explain why heaven must be after death and resurrection, and cannot be now, in this mortal earthly life. This entails, inter alia, that the unbiblical, omni-God assertion must be dropped, and God clearly conceptualized as the prime creator who worked and continues to work creation with already existent beings in an already existing universe, a universe that already contained evil. To answer the question of why we must wait for heaven, we need some such concept as the second creation, if not exactly that, to explain clearly and simply how it is that, as Jesus often explained, and as is obvious to observation, this mortal life cannot become heaven, and that is why God the prime creator was not sufficient, and that is why Jesus was necessary, and therefore why it is only on the other side of death that evil can be left behind, and we can enter heaven. Only after which can we understand the real purpose of this mortal life, which is, to learn spiritually in preparation for heaven, and the constraints of evil and entropy within which God's creative power operates on earth and in mortality. Note added 23rd of March 2024. For those unfamiliar with this blog, I should clarify my reiterated view that, in broad terms, I believe that people get what they want after death. In the sense that they will subjectively experience, or be aware of, something like what they want and ask for, or believe in terms of reincarnation or paradise, of the various types, life as a kind of ghost, Sheol, Hades, ghosts on earth etc., nirvana, extinction. The exception is when people are affiliated to demons and desire things evil, in which case they are delivered to the demons with whom they have chosen to affiliate, but this is also getting what they want, even though they will not like what they get. Only Christianity offers a cure to entropy and evil, all other religions and ideologies are palliative. Bruce Charlton. Palliative medicine is the name for a speciality when, at the end of life, a terminal illness, the focus moves from curing to helping the patient feel better. But ultimately all of medicine is palliative, because all cures are partial and temporary, and everybody degenerates and dies eventually. Analogously, all secular ideologies, all politics, all social reform and radicalism, are palliative, even when imagined to be wholly effective, palliative, because they do not address the core problems of this life on earth, which are entropy and evil. Entropy being the tendency of creation to fall back into chaos leading to degeneration and death, evil being the purposive opposition to God's plans of divine creation. But, assuming that all religions do indeed offer what they claim, only Christianity claims to cure the core problems of mortal life, only heaven claims to be a complete and permanent cure for entropy and evil. All other religions are variously palliative, in their aspiration, in their promises. The difference between Christianity and all other options is firstly resurrection of ourselves, so that we remain ourselves, but everlasting and without evil, but wholly and forever living by love of God and fellow men. And secondly, the Christian aim is heaven, when is understood as a second creation, inhabited only by those beings who have eternally committed to live by love only, and thereby left behind sin. That is, they have left behind both evil and entropy, such that heaven is wholly creative. Heavenly resurrected life does not solve all problems of existence, and is not intended to do so, because there is endless scope for love and creation. But Christian heaven does claim to solve the problems of evil and entropy, solve them once and for all. Nobody else even claims that, every other option is palliative, at best. The Illusion of Equality. William Wildblood. This is an excerpt from the last chapter of my recent book By No Means Equal, see right. As the whole Western world is enthralled to the foolish lie of equality, it's worth pointing out that equality is not a consequence of the spiritual law of love, as many people seem to assume, but a materialistic distortion of it, and, as such, it is an obstruction to real love. The idea of equality might seem reasonable to someone who has no awareness of spiritual purpose or destiny and who does not appreciate that there is a world of greater reality behind this material world which gives our outer world whatever meaning it may have. But really it is an attempt to substitute a false and artificial good for truth. This may just seem a question of well-meaning people with good intentions making a mistake, but the fact is the equality idea has been used for several decades as a tool to chip away at spiritual truth and reduce the higher to the level of the lower, creating a kind of inverted hierarchy in the process. And the well-meaning people cannot be exonerated either because they are guilty of a lack of orientation to spiritual truth. Some may even wish to supplant that with their own version of reality. Equality exists nowhere in nature. Creation itself could only happen when the darkness of non-manifestation was shattered by light, resulting in the first and fundamental inequality, which then became the ground on which cosmic order was built. Creation depends on separation and difference. An unqualified equality would have kept the universe in darkness. And darkness is what those who promote equality would have us return to, for equality can only truly exist at ground level, when everything has been brought down to nothing. If anything is to be, it must be something, and no one thing is like any other thing. Light has an infinite range of shades. Darkness is just darkness. There is true equality only in darkness. But if nature and the universe are both formed on the principle of inequality, could equality still be something that human beings should aspire to and work towards, while recognizing that it may never be actually possible to achieve? First of all, why would you wish to pattern human evolution on something that does not exist in spiritual or natural terms? Are you not thereby working against the flow of life, setting yourself up against reality? But secondly, there is no need for this. For with the principle of inequality goes that of responsible hierarchy, which means that everything has its proper place in what used to be known as the great chain of existence, which is the basis of cosmic order. Allowing and enabling all human beings to develop themselves in the context of what they are is absolutely what we should be doing, but this has nothing to do with equality, which is a chimera, the pursuit of which will only disrupt the order and harmony on which the universe is based. This is not the same as saying everyone should know and keep to their place, because another principle of life is growth. But again, this has nothing to do with equality. This idea simply introduces a false perspective. Look at history and you will see that the notion of equality only appears in civilizations when their creative energies are burning out. That does not in itself make it bad or wrong, but it does indicate that it is part of the decadent phase of any particular culture, which arises when that culture has lost connection to deeper realities and contents itself with wholly secular concerns. It comes about in a declining phase, not a developing one. Western civilization is dying. At its peak it scaled great heights, but it has fallen a long way down since then because of its denial of spirit. Unfortunately, most people think of this as an advance and a liberation from superstition, because this denial freed us to explore and exploit the material world to a greater degree, but the initial burst of energy that came from that is rapidly dissipating. Actual progress is starting to slow down, and a lot of what we thought of as progress turns out to be not without problems. Even our increased recognition of the horrors of violence and war can be understood as a greater fixation on the physical self and material well-being. How can anyone live without acknowledging God? Within each human soul there is the divine stamp that is our life and the core of our being. How can we ignore this? But it seems millions of people do. What is going on inside these people that they have closed themselves off so much from reality and all that makes life worthwhile? There is no doubt that the material world has solidified so that the connection to spirit is much harder to make, but still it is there. There is also no doubt that demonic powers have attacked on numerous fronts to make us believe the material world is all there is, but we don't have to succumb to their lies. Even if everyone around us prefers darkness to light, we do have the light within us, and we can respond to that if we are correctly oriented within ourselves to the spiritual true north. Perhaps that is the problem. Most people don't care about God because they care too much about themselves in the here and now. They are too fixated on their worldly hopes and ambitions and personal desires. They are too identified with their bodies or their feelings or their thoughts, and so never look more deeply within themselves. Then there are those who are too attached to a particular sin to be willing to acknowledge that it is a sin which they would have to do if they recognized God. Such people are setting themselves up to be the victims of the dark powers to whose influence they will become more and more susceptible. The subtitle of this book is Reclaiming the Soul. It is the soul, the spiritual component of our being, that is denied when equality is asserted, for each soul when created is original and unique, and its experiences bring out its individuality further. If you believe in the soul, you cannot also believe in equality. To do so is to apply quantitative principles to a realm of quality. A world of real equality would be a world with no room for improvement. It would be flat, without height or depth, and nothing to aspire towards. It would lack the vertical dimension and the sense of beyond. It would be a world in which numbers and measurement really were at the root of being, and that would be a controllable world in which there was neither freedom nor mystery. Fortunately for us, the world is not like that. It has its numerical, quantitative side, but that relates to matter only. There is a spiritual side, too, and that is primary. Every soul has complete spiritual reality as a person, an authentic, unique individual which cannot be reduced to anything else, for it is whole in itself. In a universe of individuals there can be no equality, but there can be love. Which would you rather have, equality or love? You can't have both. Where Berdyaev's metaphysical assumptions should have led him. Francis Berger. Short answer: non-omni-God and pluralism. I arrived at this conclusion after rereading the introduction to Berdyaev's seminal work, The Meaning of the Creative Act, in which Berdyaev outlines the following.
I know that I may be accused of a basic contradiction that tears apart all my sense of the world, all my world outlook. I shall be accused of the contradiction of combining an extreme religious dualism with an extreme religious monism. I accept such attacks in advance.
The basic contradiction Berdyaev mentions is the demarcation line of virtually all Christian thinking. Is everything of God, or are only some parts of God? However, this supposed line of demarcation is illusory. The Trinity tempers extreme religious monism in Christianity, an extreme sense of the oneness of reality. Nevertheless, Trinitarianism is still a form of monism, and it inevitably incorporates some aspects of dualism, a division of reality into two distinct parts, into its framework. In this sense, Berdyaev's basic contradiction essentially serves as the foundation of most Christian thinking.
I confess an almost Manichaean dualism. So be it. The world is evil, it is without God and not created by Him. We must go out of the world, and overcome it completely. The world must be consumed, it is the nature Ahriman. Freedom from the world is the pathos of this book. There is an objective source of evil against which we must wage a heroic war. The necessity of the given world and the given world are of Ahriman.
Berdyaev addresses the weakness of all Christian monism in the passage above. If God has indeed created everything and everything is essentially of God, then God is also the source of evil. Dualism solves this problem by separating light from darkness, which, on the surface, appears a useful approach to dealing with everything that cannot, by its very nature, be of God. If evil is not of God, then it has its own existence and must be overcome.
Over and against this stands freedom in the spirit, life in divine love, life in the pleroma. And I also confess an almost pantheistic monism. The world is divine by its very nature. Man is, by his nature, divine. The world process is self-revelation of divinity, it is taking place within divinity. God is immanent in the world and in man. There is no dualism of divine and extra-divine nature, of God's absolute transcendence of the world and man. I am entirely conscious of this antinomy of dualism and monism, and I accept it as insurmountable in consciousness and inevitable in religious life. Religious consciousness is essentially antinomic. In our consciousness, there is no escape from the eternal antinomy of transcendent and immanent, of dualism and monism.
Constructing one's metaphysical assumptions, one's deepest beliefs about the nature of reality, upon two contradictory principles or conclusions while accepting both as true hardly seems like a sound foundation upon which to base one's religious thinking, yet this is exactly what Berdyaev admits to doing, primarily because he cannot conceive of any other option. He is hardly alone. Virtually all Christian thinking through the ages has amounted to little more than perpetual ping-pong between the antinomy of dualism and monism, with the underlying understanding that religious consciousness must accept the antinomy for the simple reason that monism and dualism can both be obtained by correct reasoning. Since both can be reasoned correctly, neither is necessarily false. Since neither is necessarily false, both are true, even though they blatantly contradict in every imaginable way.
This antinomy cannot be abolished, neither in conscience nor in reason, but in religious life, in the depth of religious experience itself.
I agree with Berdyaev here. Only religious experience can abolish the antinomy of monism and dualism, and this religious experience is pluralism, and the existence of a non-omni God. Some of Berdyev's radical assumptions pointed in that direction, but for reasons I cannot understand, Berdyaev just could not take the pluralist plunge. I find this odd because pluralism would have provided a more than adequate home for nearly all of Berdyev's radical ideas, including his heterodox idea of expanding Jacob Boehmer's ungrund to absolve God of evil, thereby limiting God's omnipotence. His vehement declarations of the primacy of uncreated freedom. His insistence that man is called to co-create with God. His announcements that the ultimate purpose of divine creation was to create more God-like creators. His beliefs in the development of human consciousness. And so forth. I note the above because I sense that the antinomy of monism and dualism within Christian thinking has been stretched to its limits and is coming to an end. Christians who can find no escape from the eternal antinomy of transcendent and immanent, of dualism and monism in their religious experience will find it increasingly more difficult to remain Christian. Can't see Sorath for the Ahrimans. Francis Berger. This is basically another take on a phenomenon Dr. Charlton has noted many times on his blog. The vast majority of people in the West remain seemingly oblivious to the increasing and accelerating destruction occurring all around them. Whenever they do sense it, they are quick to downplay it, contextualize it, or rationalize it as anything but actual destruction. You could chalk this up to some innate optimism or live for the day mentality, but the extent of perceptible destruction in Western societies challenges such notions. I posit that modern Westerners cannot see Sorath for the Ahrimans. People are so wrapped up in the details and trivialities of what is unfolding that they cannot perceive, let alone grasp or accept, the situation as a whole. The source of the details and trivialities is Ahriman, the demon of bureaucracy possessing virtually all Western governments, companies, institutions, organizations, and committees. All aspects of this Ahrimanic bureaucracy now actively seek and implement programs of destruction. However, the masses tolerate the destruction precisely because it is being administered via impersonal bureaucratic programs. Since impersonal bureaucratic programs have become the lifeblood of what people perceive Western civilization as, they cannot accept that such programs would actively seek to destroy on a grand, civilizational scale, even when confronted by stark evidence of such destruction. As long as Ahriman is, Sorath cannot be. Such appears to be the reigning rationalization among the masses. Yes, but what should we actually do? More on life as a spiritual quest. Bruce Charlton. I remain sure that we are walking a tightrope, vacillating on the cusp of World War III. A situation quite deliberately contrived by the anonymous, but closely demon-allied, and spitefully destructive, powers that deceptively control the Western leadership class, who are themselves, still, consumed with fantasies of a single, global, totalitarian system, that they imagine will be dedicated to their various leftist goals, that they imagine will diminish human suffering and implement social justice and that stuff. The entirety of mainstream politics and public discourse in the West, including the pseudo-populists and pretend radicals, are merely office squabbles within the totalitarian bureaucracy. In terms of public life, the available choice is therefore between either shoring up the crumbling evil empire, or working to accelerate the inevitable collapse of the empire by encouraging socio-economic collapse, by starvation, disease, poisonings, induced mental illness, etc. This, by making and sustaining international and civil wars, while personally exploiting the situation for temporary short-term hedonism, in a nutshell, looting the maelstrom. A situation I have previously summarized as the choice between Ahrimanic and Sorathic evils. To engage in politics is therefore to join with one or other evil, and thereby to embark on the self-consuming downslope towards self-chosen damnation and the inevitability of eternal misery. But if not, then what? If we disengage from public politics, what will then happen? Most people seem to feel that disengaging their core motivations and daily actions from the hamster wheel of opinions concerning politics, mass media, office infighting, and scheming for personal gratification, amounts to quietism at best but more likely to defeatism and a pathetic state of victimhood, surrender, submission and despair. And this would be true, so long as we were operating from the mainstream materialistic assumptions of our civilization and culture. Yet, if we decide instead to acknowledge the reality and primacy of the spiritual realm, a whole range of different possibilities emerge. Then the quest of our mortal existence is primarily spiritual, is rooted in the spiritual, and if the spiritual is recognized to include and be led by the realms of thinking, then we find ourselves in a very different world and life. If every day is regarded as the latest installment in a spiritual quest, then the trials and triumphs of life are taken away from the control of the material institutions of this world, the governments, bureaucracies, corporations, etc. We instead enter and inhabit a world in which we personally have a significant role to play, a job to do, always things to learn, always new understandings to grapple with. This is not a condition of bliss, but a world of extreme variety of challenges and difficulties. Analogously to the quest of a fairy tale, there are challenges and hazards, and times of rest and recuperation. There is the cruelty and deceptions of ogres and witches, but also there is help unforeseen from good wizards and kind old ladies. There are enemies all around us. But, also, the enemies are within as well as without, since we are all a mixture of good and evil motivations and loyalties. Although we may choose to take the side of good, we can never, in this mortal life, permanently escape the tendencies and temptations of evil, which will weaken, subvert, and try to invert our good intentions. Indeed, the less problem we have from external enemies, the more dominant become the internal. Even if we lived in an ideal society where we had no enemies but only helpful friends, we would still be faced by potentially spiritually lethal hazards. Even the greatest saints spend much time fighting inner demons, because, as saints, they were much more aware of them than most people. The saints did not project by blaming others, what actually were their own weaknesses and sins. The life of spiritual quest never ends, at least not until after death, and, although we can expect to win some of the battles, we cannot win any final victory during this mortal life. Therefore such a quest requires not just courage, but actual heroism. All the more so because we cannot, and should not, expect the traditional material rewards of a fairy tale hero, the cheering crowds, parades to honor us, a great feast and the rewards of treasure and the hand in marriage of a beautiful princess. In our world, such public rewards go to the most obedient and effective servants of Satan. There are rewards, spiritual rewards, mostly small and temporary, but some larger and more lasting. Yet these rewards are invisible to most, or sometimes all, of the people around us, and it is part of the heroism that this reality be accepted. In conclusion, a life of spiritual quest, taken with the ultimate, because eternal, seriousness it demands, is not an easy life option, but it is one that everybody can do, and should do, whatever his circumstances, whatever his aptitudes. What I am trying to get across here, is that even in a public and material world of only bad alternatives, only choices between lesser evils, a world ruled by affiliates of Satan and collapsing towards the celebration of sins. Even in such a world as this, our personal life can, if we personally choose to make it so, and if we do then nobody and nothing can prevent it, become one of positive personal action, every minute of every day. On a daily basis, hour by hour, moment by moment, we, that is, you and me, can be fighting the good fight while motivated by attainable goals. We can have the deep life satisfactions of working for positive, and potentially eternal, good, no matter what our situation may be, no matter what happens in the material world. And, because the spiritual is primary and the material is just a manifestation of the spiritual, we can confidently know that all spiritual benefit will have material consequences, whether or not we notice, know, or understand the exact workings of such outcomes. Free will is freer slavery, not freedom. Francis Berger. Mostly irrelevant preface. When I was a kid, I used to chuckle at the notion that the United States was a politically free country because it granted its citizens the right to choose between two political parties, as opposed to the Soviet Union, which offered only one real choice. Many Christians continue to fall into the trap of defining evil as a product of the free will God granted or created into humanity, out of nothing, of course. This immediately begs the following question: if God knew man might use free will for evil, then why did he equip man with free will? Simple, because he did not wish to make man a slave of good, an automaton incapable of choosing anything but good. He wanted man to choose good over evil freely and willingly because, morality. You see, if God had not created free will, a doctrine that essentially boils down to being able to choose between good and evil, then there would be no morality, nor spirituality, nor anything beyond the physical/material. The problem with the doctrine of free will is simple: it is not about freedom at all. Free will is just an algorithm. If God grants man free will, then whatever freedom resides within it emanates from God, not man. Secondly, God determines the scope and range of choice to which free will may be applied. On the one side is the good choice to abide by God's law and commands. On the other side, rejecting this law and embracing evil. Thus, the free will choice essentially boils down to obeying God's law and commands, or else. Free will enslaves man to the necessity of choice. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound very moral or spiritual. Accountability is another problem with free will. The free will doctrine makes man accountable for his choices between good and evil within the context of God's laws and commands. It places the onus of such choices on man while simultaneously exempting God from all accountability. The doctrine of free will provides man the freedom to be the offender while simultaneously relieving God of all responsibility for evil choices. Thus, man must own his choice for evil, but God is under no obligation to own his choice for giving man the power to choose. Man's free will choice to be a transgressor of divine law also justifies God's role as a punisher of divine law transgressions. The free will doctrine is God adopting a my way or the highway framework of freedom. Use the free will I provided to do what I command, and all will be well. Use the free will I provided to reject my commands, and all will be lost. Seen this way, the free will choice to obey God's law and command becomes a matter of necessity. Man needs to choose the good option God has provided or face the consequences. The need to choose the good, this necessity inherent within the free will choice, does not emanate from within man but is externally imposed by God. As such, it does little more than ask a man to adhere to or fulfill a given law or command, leaving no space for creativity or a creative act. The free will doctrine reduces man to a mere instrument in the fulfillment of God's law. It lacks all spiritual dynamism, and ultimately relegates freedom to the level of submission. True spiritual freedom does not reside within the framework of the free will doctrine. True spiritual freedom is not about choosing between good and evil but knowing what constitutes authentic creative alignment and harmony with God and creation. True spiritual freedom can only exist if freedom is uncreated, if the freedom and agency of beings in creation are not of God. God is good because he has mastered freedom. God no longer needs to choose between good and evil. God knows what he must do and does it. Men and other beings are capable of evil because they have not or refuse to master their freedom. True spiritual freedom liberates from the necessity of having to choose. Spiritual freedom is not about agonizing over externally imposed good and evil choices, it is about internally/spiritually knowing what good is and doing/thinking that. The need to choose never enters the picture. Freedom is not and cannot be reduced to the free will doctrine of merely choosing between external, given choices. If it is, it becomes an enslaving force, a burden that diminishes man to a level of submitting to good, albeit with some limited say. Man is free when he doesn't have to choose, when he aligns with God and creation. How does he know that what he is thinking and doing is good? When he applies his freedom to loving God, and it brings forth creativity. Note, this post is basically just a rehashing of ideas I have written about many times on this blog. Getting what you want, or believe, after death, how does this work for the God-rejecting, the demon-affiliated? Bruce Charlton. For those unfamiliar with this blog, I should clarify my oft-reiterated view that, in broad terms, I believe that people get what they want after death. This, in the sense that they will subjectively experience, or be aware of, something like what they want and ask for, or believe in terms of reincarnation or paradise, of the various types, life as a kind of ghost, Sheol, Hades, ghosts on earth etc., nirvana, extinction, and so forth. Whatever they want, that, or something essentially of its nature, is what they experience. Therefore all religions are true, by this meaning, anyway. I think it a valuable exercise or thought experiment, to compare religions, and Christian denominations, in this way. Suppose that they really offer what they promise to adherents. You will find that each is very different, and also that some offer a great deal more than others, as their highest reward. An apparent exception to getting what you want is when people are affiliated to demons and desire things evil, in which case they are delivered to the demons with whom they have chosen to affiliate. But this is also getting what they want, even though they will not like what they get, because what is at issue is opposition to God, God's agenda, divine creation, and all that is good in this context. To affiliate oneself in opposition to creation in such a fundamental fashion, is a negation, rather than a positive desire, it is a disbelief rather than a belief. The party of Satan, i.e. the demons, and their servants, is therefore the gang of those who are united only in terms of what they oppose, what they do not want. The relationships between the demon-affiliated beings is therefore, in ultimate terms, necessarily oppositional. There is no loyalty between them, because there is no love, no genuine cooperation, but only mutual exploitation, sometimes a temporary alliance for mutual advantage, no long-term plan but only competing expediencies of the individual beings. Consequently, while they may experience temporary pleasures, the situational and intrinsic misery of demons and their affiliates is also their choice. By their bottom-line rejection of divine creation, a choice has been made that has the inevitable consequence of existence without purpose, without meaning, thus without hope. In other words, a choice of eternal despair. If it sounds implausible that anyone would choose despair, then you might consider what normal, mainstream, atheistic materialists assert concerning the purposelessness, meaninglessness, and essential horror of life, and, they are sure, will happen to them after death, utter annihilation. And consider how vehemently such people will defend the necessity, truth, inevitability of their choice of belief. Consider also their aggressive, scornful attitude towards any person or religion that asserts, or chooses to believe, that life has purpose, meaning, is ultimately good, and or has a happy ending. I find it all too easy to imagine that such beings will choose despair, and stick with their choice. If evil is the product of free will, then free will has no place in heaven. Berger. Adding on to yesterday's post contra the idea that evil is the product of human free will, a free will that God created into humans, so that they could be free to choose good rather than simply being created good and having no choice in the matter, it occurred to me that if evil truly is the product of free will, then free will has no place in heaven. Since heaven is without evil, entropy, or death, no force or motivation that could choose or produce evil, entropy, or death could enter heaven. In other words, those desiring to heaven would have to check their God-given, God-created free will at the gates because it will no longer be necessary. Without that free will, resurrected man would have no choice but to be good, which takes us back to square one. If God is good, why does he permit evil in mortal life but not resurrected life? Why bother with the whole free will journey in mortal life if that gift of God's love and goodness must be checked at the door before entering heaven? Why didn't just God place us in heaven to begin with? Because he wanted us to choose goodness and eternal life over evil and death. Okay, but in the end, we will have to surrender free will because that, apparently, is where the source of all evil lies. Something else must take the place of free will. God will have to grant us another kind of freedom in heaven. Now, I suppose we could argue that free will in mortal life builds up to some greater, eternal freedom we will gain access to in heaven, but if this is indeed the case, it seems like a roundabout way of going about things. Unless of course, freedom in mortal life extends far beyond a lifetime's worth of free will choices. Freedom is not and cannot be necessity. Necessity is imposed externally. If freedom is externally imposed, it is not truly freedom. If God imposed free will upon us, that free will is not freedom but necessity. Under free will, we have no choice but to choose. Moreover, we are held completely accountable for the products of these necessary choices. That doesn't sound very free. It sounds positively burdensome. Free will cannot be true spiritual freedom. If it were, it would have a place in heaven, but it cannot because it is cited as the source of all evil. No, freedom, true spiritual freedom, must be something other than free will. It cannot reside in the realm of necessity. It cannot be something God gifts us when we begin mortal life. For freedom to be free, it must be outside of God, not something God creates. It must be something inherent in our being, something we bring into creation, something God has little or no control over. It must also be capable of good and evil choices, but its ultimate purpose must exist far beyond the good-evil choice paradigm. Unlike free will, true spiritual freedom is not something we will have to surrender in heaven. On the contrary, true spiritual freedom is one of the overarching reasons for heaven. Having said all of that, I sense that it is extremely difficult to achieve true spiritual freedom in mortal life, at least on a consistent and permanent basis, and I sometimes wonder if we are even meant to attain such freedom in mortal life, again on a consistent, permanent basis. I sometimes think of freedom in the same way I think about sin. The flesh may be weak, we may not be able to rise above the free will choice level of freedom, but the spirit must be willing to aspire to a kind of freedom that transcends free will choosing. What I mean is that we must at least become aware of what true spiritual freedom is and work toward that in some manner, however intermittent and temporary our success may be. I think this is a better way of expressing freedom than using our free will to choose among predetermined, externally imposed choices. Also, as with sin, I think we should acknowledge whenever we fall short of using our innate freedom and fall back on mere free will instead of lauding our successful use of free will as some sort of major spiritual accomplishment that is guaranteed to reap eternal rewards. I sense that true spiritual freedom, willing and creative alignment with God's purposes where we also add something to creation, something God could not have added on his own, is our state in heaven. I say this because I can't imagine free will having any place in heaven. Note, this post was sparked by a comment exchange with Lyeth on yesterday's post. Something snapped. The world turns on its dark side, it is winter. Bruce Charlton. The poignant chorus that opens Michael Tippett's A Child of Our Time came to mind this morning, as I contemplated my sense of a turn towards darkness, a line being crossed, apparent extinction of the possibility of this worldly hope. This is, of course, not provable by any material/objective/public evidence or logic, but I feel that something which was holding back some significant number of men to be motivated by God and good, seems to me to have snapped. Snapped in response to the unremitting destructiveness and aggressive untruthfulness of the Western leadership class. Some slender yet lingering optimism has blinked out, a belief concerning the possibility that national and globalist rulers, could, sometime soon, perhaps learn from experience, might awaken to spiritual reality, and potentially step backwards from teetering on the knife edge that they have constructed for mankind. Some aspiration that others, elsewhere in the world, would, overall, in principle, cleave to God's agenda, in face of the general trend. I sense that the camel's back has broken under the final straw. Inner intimations of good groupings, somewhere, somehow, feelings that I hardly knew I previously held, have been snuffed out like a guttering candle. They have, it seems, pushed, and pushed, with their reckless escalating of threats to mankind being used to blackmail compliance, until just now the constraints on fallible mortal men have snapped, and suddenly many have switched from good motivations to evil motivations. The tragedy of sustained war, of any kind, but especially a spiritual war, is that while explicit material aims may remain the same, and the sides in dispute may be much as before in their membership, the spiritual situation has been transformed, because suddenly good aims are poisoned by evil underlying spiritual motivations. Then, a side that was good, is now motivated by evil. Those demon servants who asserted the evil of their enemies from the beginning, see themselves vindicated. See? They say, I always told you they are wicked, whereas it was actually the effect of their own unremitting spite against their enemies that sapped the will to good, brutalized, and finally broke the minds of the once good. Once someone is committed to evil, they can always find plenty of evidence of evil in others, because evil always is present in others. This world and its beings is mixed between God and Satan. It is not ourselves, but only our spiritual affiliations, that can be for good. Yet, in the spiritual war, because a commitment to God, good, divine creation, is an inner thing that cannot be proved or refuted in any objective fashion, it can be claimed by anyone. Claimed especially by those who serve the agenda of evil, and who live by lies and are driven by a positive belief in sin. In such matters we must, because there is no alternative, as well as because it is what God desires of us, use personal discernment. And take personal responsibility for this usage, not sheltering behind some external authority whose inner true motivations we almost never can know. In this modern era, appeals to authority are merely rhetorical, not real, mere public discourse and not a valid basis for determining our eternal destiny. Our basic spiritual task in a world that has indeed turned to the dark side is not qualitatively different from that which has confronted earlier generations, and we in the West have already been living in such a world of spiritual winter for some decades. There are no good sides anymore, not anywhere in the material world, but only in the spiritual world. And this is a lesson well worth learning, essential indeed, so that we are not led astray by loyalty to nations, institutions, corporations, churches who in their hearts have embraced sinful motives. Eclipses. William Wildblood. I have been interested in the astrological effects of eclipses since 1999, when I witnessed the solar eclipse in August of that year, and a few days later a friend of mine, whose natal Jupiter was practically bang on the degree of the eclipse, had a heart attack. A few days after that he died. It seemed too significant to ignore. Now there are two more eclipses to consider, a lunar one that took place today, March 25th, and a solar one coming up on 8th April. These two eclipses both connect with the horoscope of someone else I know. The lunar eclipse was directly on the degree of her ascendant at 5 degrees Libra, and the solar eclipse, which will be on 19 degrees Aries, makes a very close contact with her natal Sun, North Node and, slightly more distantly, Saturn, these three being conjunct in her chart. I don't know what this might indicate, though my suspicion is nothing good, especially with regard to the solar eclipse. At any rate, the close contacts warrant study, and I shall observe their outcome with interest, tinged with a little concern on her behalf. For it seems to me that if the traditional view of the effects of eclipses is correct, then this person might be in for some turbulent times. As always, how the symbolism works out in real-life terms depends on how much the subject is able to process and integrate the psychic energies brought into play, how conscious she is of herself. Someone who is aware of her personality strengths and weaknesses and who does not deny, suppress or ignore her shortcomings might be able to deal with the forces at play on a psychological level and even channel the energy creatively. Someone in denial might find that the forces manifest externally in life events. But then again, there are certain times when the universe will have its way with us regardless, for though we have freedom, there are what you might call cosmic currents and tides which will take us with them however well we can swim. It is worth remembering though that even if a cosmic event has what in worldly terms is a negative effect on us, it is usually all for the spiritual good. The powers that be do not judge as we do. The heart attack suffered by my friend 25 years ago might have been a spiritual blessing in that it paved the way for his release from corporeal imprisonment and took him home. I'm not saying that all suffering is sent by God. That would be both stupid and unfeeling. But in the larger sense, much of it does contain lessons for the soul, and if we are the ones suffering, it is always worth looking for these lessons. It is only spiritual children who expect God to hand out sweets and candy all the time. If an eclipse touches our natal chart, there is an element of providence about it, a significant spiritual lesson. Added note, I should say that the dramatic effect noted in the example from 1999 does not mean that any time an eclipse touches a sensitive part of the horoscope, disaster strikes. What it probably does do is bring out what is already there, so in this case an already weak heart may have been triggered, though again I am not saying it is a matter of cause and effect. The truth is, how astrology works remains a mystery. We can talk about influences or moments in time having the same quality or the interconnectedness of everything in the universe, but really no one knows how astrology works. The fact is, it just does. In the fourth gospel, light is life. Bruce Charlton. In the fourth gospel, I have found it is helpful to regard the word light as usually meaning life, in particular resurrected eternal life. Light means more than this, because words in Greek 2000 years ago has multiple and simultaneous meanings, but thinking of light as life as a first approximation can be helpful. This helps understand what Jesus is saying towards the end of the 12th chapter. You can read the whole thing here, but I am going to select what I believe are the important and original passages on a particular theme of light and life. Selected, because some parts of the 12th chapter strike me as probable later additions by another hand, of an interpretative and commentary nature, thereby interpolating sometimes alien theological assumptions or church-justifying practices. I have included my own interpretative notes in italics. These notes are abbreviated, and may themselves be unclear, but maybe they will provide helpful hints on what Jesus is getting at, and what he is not getting at.
Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone, but if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit.
We all, including Jesus himself, need to die in order to attain resurrected, eternal heavenly life.
He that loveth his life shall lose it, and he that hateth his life in this world shall keep it unto life eternal.
Those who make this mortal life their priority, will not achieve resurrection. Only those who recognize that our ultimate destination and gratification lies on the other side of death, will attain everlasting life. Hateth is intended in a non-literal, not absolute, and relative sense. Jesus means that all the value of life in this world is given by the reality of life after resurrection.
If any man serve me, let him follow me, and where I am, there shall also my servant be. If any man serve me, him will my Father honor.
Jesus is saying he will die and be resurrected, where I am, and those who love him may follow this same path to be in the same place and state, and that this following is the path to eternal life in heaven. Anyone who does, in this sense of follow Jesus, will follow the same path to heaven. In other words, Jesus is not asking men to serve him as servants as a prerequisite and price necessary to being allowed eternal life. From context, this would be utterly alien to teachings of the gospel and chapter. He is saying that nature of the service Jesus requires is to follow him.
Now is the judgment of this world, now shall the prince of this world be cast out.
Jesus is announcing that men may henceforth escape from the devil, may live only by good and free from all evil. As made clear before, this is escape on the other side of death. In other words, the escape from evil is via resurrection.
And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me.
Jesus, in being lifted up from the earth, will attain resurrected heavenly life in heaven, which word includes the meaning of sky, and by love of Jesus all men may choose to follow where he has gone up into heaven. I think that drawing us to heaven is meant as a variation on the path being by following Jesus. Jesus makes the path, and all we need to do is follow that path. Contra the omitted following verses, this verse is not about Jesus being raised from the ground by the execution process of killing somebody on a cross. That is not the subject of this discourse.
Then Jesus said unto them, Yet a little while is the light with you. Walk while ye have the light, lest darkness come upon you, for he that walketh in darkness knoweth not whither he goeth. While ye have light, believe in the light, that ye may be the children of light.
Probably controversially, I think this is not primarily Jesus talking about himself as the light, and that he will soon die, but instead Jesus talking about mortal life, and how mortal life should be conducted, i.e. our proper attitude to living, while yet we still live, i.e. before we die. I think Jesus is saying that we need to attend to our mortal lives, walk while ye have the light, while we live. The alternative is that darkness will come upon you, that you will die, and not be resurrected. He that walketh in darkness is one who denies the reality or possibility of eternal life, and therefore knows not what will happen, where he will go, after death. While we are alive, while we have light, we ought to believe in the light, that is, we ought to acknowledge the significance of this mortal life. While ye have light, believe in the light, that ye may be the children of light. I think Jesus is implying that, on the one hand, our ultimate priority must be eternal resurrected life. But on the other hand, while we live now, although this mortal life is temporary, we have important work to do. We ought not to wish our mortal lives away. Profoundly, to be children of eternal life entails that we be children of this mortal life. It is neither atheistic materialism, and its exclusive focus on this mortal incarnate life, nor the life-denying philosophies that regard embodied mortal life as profoundly negative and yearn for eternal life, typically as spirits. Even more strongly, if we do not give this mortal life its due importance, we are also becoming children of darkness and not children of life. We are embracing death and not resurrection.
I am come a light into the world, that whosoever believeth on me should not abide in darkness. And if any man hear my words, and believe not, I judge him not, for I came not to judge the world, but to save the world.
Roughly speaking, Jesus is reaffirming that his job is to bring light to the world, that is, resurrected eternal heavenly life. Darkness is the death which is ghost-like severance of spirit from body, the Sheol of the ancient Hebrews, the Hades of the ancient Greeks, in which men abode until Jesus made possible resurrection. Not as a judge, implies that Jesus is offering this as a gift, as a possibility, available to all men by their own choice, and not in terms of some judgment of Jesus about our suitability. Overall, Jesus is talking about the new possibility of resurrection, and how attaining this gift is made possible. Should you be worried about the widespread adulteration of food? Bruce Charlton. No, you should not be worried about the adulteration of food. I am sure that food is adulterated with all manner of undesirable things. But you should not worry about it, because adulteration is everywhere, affects almost everything, and there is nothing you can do about it. You don't even know which of so many are the most significant problems, nor what they do to you. And quite likely neither do those who are doing the adulterating. Understand that it is the easiest thing in the world to contaminate food, it requires no intelligence, and very little knowledge, and there are so many forms of contamination, that avoidance is impossible and worry is a waste of time. They control all the major institutions of the Western world, and there are innumerable ways to adulterate food. If they want to adulterate the food, or the water supply, or farmland and farm animals, or medicines, or anything, then they can and will do so, whenever they so choose, and with impunity. Trying to evade that which is ubiquitous is futile. Worse, food phobia is a black hole of attention, resources and time. Just think of vegans. Okay, enough? Now stop thinking of vegans. Doesn't that feel better? They would love for us all to expend our mortal lives in trying to avoid and escape that which can neither be avoided nor escaped. What they do not want us to attend to, is that battle that each person fights for himself and that only himself can fight, the spiritual war of these end times. Not a convincing kind of blog. Berger. The longer this blog goes on, the less motivated I am to convince anyone of anything. I'm all for sharing my ideas and assumptions or expounding on the ideas and assumptions of others, and I welcome comments that agree or disagree with all of that. However, I have become utterly uninterested in trying to convince anyone of the rightness or wrongness of my stated positions, opinions, beliefs, notions, or assumptions, not out of indifference or conceit but from my recent realization that the time for convincing anyone of anything has passed. Once again, this does not entail that I refuse to consider disagreements, new information, or other points of view, only that I do not want anyone to convince me. I do consider most of what people share here. It often helps me to expand my understanding or re-examine whatever idea I have shared. At the same time, I feel no desire to wade into drawn-out comment exchanges that hope to convince me. Conversely, I feel no impetus to hammer my thoughts into anyone else's head. The etymology of convince may help shed some light on my aversion to convincing anyone of anything in this time and place. The word stems from the Latin con, meaning with, and vincere, to conquer. Thus, convincing is all about decisively overcoming and defeating someone else in an argument, to firmly persuade by argument, usually with the support of some kind of evidence. At its root, convince is a bellicose, fighting word, but convincing is not the kind of fight I want to have with anyone here and now. Dr. Charlton has written extensively on the primacy of assumptions, particularly metaphysical assumptions, and how those, not experience, not education, not facts, not evidence, fundamentally shape our relationship with the world. Assumptions are essentially unprovable beliefs, and it is these unprovable beliefs that provide the foundation for everything else a person accepts as real or unreal. And, yes, this extends well into the provable stuff, too. I don't find the old argument battle framework appealing anymore because my self-declared argument opponents cannot grasp that we are on entirely different battlefields with no hope of meaningful engagement. The best anyone can hope to do now is to share ideas and assumptions unobtrusively and peaceably. Whoever wants to consider the ideas and assumptions will consider them, not by being overcome or conquered by decisive arguments but by thinking more deeply about his own ideas and assumptions. Which is exactly what everyone should be doing in this time and place instead of yearning to conquer or be conquered with arguments. Why are innately evil people incarnated? Bruce Charlton. Our thoughts may be transparent, but our fundamental selves are not. Thus God knows what we are thinking, but does not know our hearts. This is important to recognize, because it explains why so many people are incarnated into this mortal life, who seem to be evil, and evil in an apparently unredeemable way. Who appear to be utterly incapable of love, or to hate love, and who behave accordingly. If the human heart/soul/ultimate self were transparent to God, i.e. if God knew for sure that such people were structurally incapable of love, then there would be no reason for innately evil people to be incarnated into mortal life. Because mortal life could do such persons no good, because they are incapable of learning the lessons of this world, and because there are many reasons for hopelessly evil people not to be incarnated, since they cause so much suffering, and may induce other people to engage in and desire evil. This world and life therefore make best sense if we realize that God does not know our fundamental nature, cannot see into our hearts, and cannot be sure of any individual that he will not at some point in his life, learn spiritually, repent, and eventually accept the gift of salvation. Such is one reason why this world contains individuals who truly are greatly evil, some who were, apparently, born evil, some who seem incapable of good, even some who, in their hearts, if anyone but knew that, may be totally evil. Note, it is likely that very few of the famously historically evil leaders were innately and totally evil, since this would usually be a bar to social success and power. Past societies were also alert and keen to exclude or eliminate, one way or another, such persons. Total evil is most likely to be seen among children, youths, and among obscure adults, and is probably much commoner in modern societies, where value inversion is positively regarded, official and enforced. My rather tepid Good Friday. Bruce Charlton. This Good Friday I find myself more than usually afflicted by the lifelong prejudice against the time and place of Jesus' life and ministry. I never have, and still don't, find it inspiring or very interesting to focus on the facts and images of the Holy Land AD 30 to 33-ish. This was enough to push and keep me away from Christianity for most of my life, since, by contrast, and like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, I am much more attracted by northerners of a Germanic, Scandinavian and British kind. So, I don't much want to be constantly reminded that Jesus was of a different kind, and in a very different place, and exactly this constant reminding is the staple diet, dished out by most sermons I have heard. Therefore, my inclination is to react against the usual practice of tying Christianity, or rather being a Christian, to the historical and geographical context of Jesus. I don't suppose I am alone in this. It is obvious that many Christian cultures have preferred to reimagine Jesus in terms of their own times and places, or to focus on local saints and heroes of faith. This is, however, particularly difficult in Easter, where the whole thing is very specifically located. It maybe helps account, although there are also other reasons, for my lukewarm attitude to this part of the liturgical calendar, despite its status as officially the most important Christian festival. Therefore, I wish a happy-ish Easter to all my readers. Note added, although prejudice should be acknowledged as such, I can justify my indifference on the grounds that far too much attention has been paid to the historical aspects of Jesus, and far too little about what he did. I believe that understanding what Jesus did, renders the historical and geographical aspects all but irrelevant, and something that probably should, largely, be set aside, for most people, most of the time, once the significance is grasped. Today is Good Friday, but Easter is coming. William Wildblood. I hope it's not sacrilegious to say that sometimes it feels as though the disciples of the world are going through a kind of Gethsemane experience at the moment. Most people will not feel this, but those who are responsive to the spiritual level will be aware of the gathering darkness. The bad news is that Gethsemane precedes Good Friday. The good news is that Good Friday precedes Easter Sunday. There is undoubtedly more darkness to come, but if we allow it, this can be a cleansing, purifying darkness for our souls that prepares them for the light. Many of the incidents in Jesus' life can be seen as experiences that come to the soul as it progresses on the spiritual path, and the most significant are those that come at the end of his life. Abandoned by friends and, seemingly, even God, the soul is thrown back entirely on itself. Its spiritual gifts, if it had them, are withdrawn, its earthly renown, if it had it, is lost. It is no one and nothing with only faith, and the intuitive sense of truth to support it. This is the final purification that strips the soul of any worldliness and self-regard that may still be clinging to it, so that it becomes light enough to enter the spiritual world. For these are like heavy weights that hold the soul down and will prevent it rising until they are cast off. This is on the individual level. But patterns repeat themselves at all stages of the path and in all spheres, both on the individual and the group level, and the whole world is experiencing something similar. There is a sorting out of that part of humanity that has the potential to rise, and that part which may be held over for future development. We are being presented with a choice which in the simplest terms amounts to God or this world. But note that many people might think they are opting for God when in fact they are in the worldly camp. One of the tests of the present time is that it is no longer sufficient merely to give your allegiance to an earthly institution. All are corrupted, and you have to see the reality behind the institution as far more important than the thing itself. Which, of course, means you have to be able to perceive something of this reality. There is no getting around the fact that the spiritual life can only be known by those who undergo worldly death, and this death must be undergone willingly. Before the soul can become united with God, it must die to the world and be stripped of itself. Look at the times to come as part of that process, for we all, however spiritual or religious we may consider ourselves to be, are sinners, and what that means is our center is ourself. We may have relatively good selves or relatively bad selves, but until we know, really know, that we are as nothing and all we are comes from the Creator, the tendency to sin, which means act from the center of self, remains. The whole of the spiritual life is about replacing self with God at the center of our being. Good Friday is the start of that process, and Easter Sunday the glorious conclusion. But now is my kingdom not from hence. Francis Berger.
Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but now is my kingdom not from hence. John 18:36.
Great temptation consists in the identification of Christianity with any sort of the kingdom of Caesar, i.e., in the enslavement of the infinite to the finite. Christianity is not revolutionary in the outward sense of the word. It has not entered into the world as a revolutionary social force, calling for a violent altering of the order of life. It is impossible even to call Christianity a force of social reform. The nature of Christianity is altogether inexpressible in the social categories of this world. Christianity has come into the world as the good news about salvation and about the kingdom of God, which is not of this world. In the world, truth is crucified. Nikolai Berdyaev.
The literally delusional nature of that resentment which motivates so much socio-political action. Bruce Charlton. The thing about paranoid and persecutory delusions, that is, beliefs that are false, strongly held, powerfully motivating, in practice irrefutable, is that they cannot be contradicted by further knowledge or experience. Once a person has decided that X is out to get them, is harming or will harm them in some way, then the whole cognitive apparatus is orientated towards collecting evidence based on this assumption. The assumption shapes the entire realm of facts, interpretation and theory. This delusional mechanism happens at the individual level, but also the long-standing, and sometimes all-consuming, resentments of history are understandable in this way. For example, in the world today, one race may attribute its low socio-economic situation to the effect of racism, while another race infers the reality of massive and worldwide racism despite occupying the highest socio-economic status and power. Once the assumption of racism, or sexism, or fill in the word phobia has been made, and once a person, or race/sex/orientation, builds its motivational system around racism, there is no possible empirical evidence or argument that can shake this delusion. In a very fundamental sense, it does not matter whether there is some or even a great deal of truth to the delusion of being persecuted. The point is that the delusion is a psychological and motivational fact, for which reality is an irrelevance. Once established, a change in reality does not change the delusion. Therefore, when delusional thinking underlies political movement, as it so often does, when one group is delusionally convinced of the hostility of another, then there can, in principle, be no political solution to the problem. Even a final solution of eradication of the perceived threat will fail, because it will turn out that the threat has not, after all, been eradicated, but continues in some covert or crypto form. The currently influential concept of implicit racism is a clear example. Even after all perceptible racism has been eliminated, racism nonetheless remains, and all the more threatening because of its invisibility. I have termed these theory of mind delusions, because they are based on normal cognitive processes, i.e. they are not psychotic, and instead are rooted in a false inference concerning the intent and motivations of others, but this false inference cannot be corrected by evidence, because other people's minds are not transparent, and can only be inferred indirectly. What this means, as I, apparently, never tire of saying, is that recognizing and critiquing the basis of underlying assumptions is of extreme importance. We all base our understanding upon assumptions of a metaphysical kind, that can neither be proved nor refuted, therefore we have a profound individual responsibility to examine our own baseline assumptions about the world with respect to coherence and goodness, because some assumptions sustain a good life and society, while others are deeply and incurably pernicious in their effects. And ultimately the spiritual victims of that resentment which is rooted in delusional thinking, is the resenter himself, because resentment is a sin that must, like all sins, be repented if we are to want to choose salvation. Because we cannot carry our resentments into heaven, which is a place motivated only by love, we must check our resentment in at the door, permanently. One who does not want to leave behind all sins, does not want heaven, but something else instead. And resentment is an especially pervasive and dangerous sin to modern Western man, because it is widely inculcated, engineered, encouraged, rewarded, sometimes mandatory. In some, theory of mind-rooted assumptions are inevitable and ubiquitous forms of thinking. What makes an assumption delusional is essentially that it is an evil model of reality. Even when delusional thinking has some factual basis, it is an evil, because it is a spiritually false orientation of life, a projection of attention and motivation onto other people that denies our absolute personal responsibility for our own salvation and theosis. The harm of such delusions is primarily spiritual and related to eternal postmortal life, although the material harms caused by this trap of thinking during this world and life may also be colossal. Fight is only a variant of if only everybody would just be nice. Bruce Charlton. Things are much worse than most people think. That is clear from the if only conversations and writings that seem to have plagued the world for hundreds of years at least. So many people through history have pointed out that if only people would just be nice, kind, reasonable, sensible, or whatever, then how much better this world would be. Yes indeed, but the whole point is that people are not thus, and show no signs of significant improvement in their natures. A variant of this are the appeals for people to fight this, that or the other. If only a few people would awaken to their own power, band together, organize, vote, fight, then we could win. Such exhortations are always, whether explicitly or implicitly, about us and what we could do if only we would fight. Yes indeed, but the whole point is that, here and now, in real life, people don't and won't fight. Or, at least, they will fight only when they are compelled by the government, get paid, or attain high status for fighting. Although some people will fight without reward, from their pleasure in destruction, bullying, and infliction of pain. And therefore, because their motivations are bad, people will only in practice fight on the side of evil, because, in terms of spiritual virtue, motivations are what matter. What's more, even if people could be well motivated to fight on the side of God and good, who exactly would they fight? The answer is that those who fought for good would need to fight those on the side of evil. But things are much worse than most people think, and those on the side of evil are not a handful of dark lords and elite lieutenants, the elimination of whom would win the spiritual war, but instead those on the side of evil is almost everybody. If you really, rather than merely rhetorically, were to fight, then you would nearly always start by fighting your family and friends, moving on to neighbors and colleagues, very soon including almost everybody. Those involved in almost every social system, those responsible for food, water, energy, building and repair, trade and transport, retail etc., as well as police and the military. The evil that rules this world controls all these, and the other, politics, media, law, education, health, arts, science, social systems, so all of them is exactly who and what you would need to fight. And even supposing you were able to inflict significant damage on them, by destroying the system, you would certainly cause the sooner, rather than later, collapse of Western civilization. Things are much worse than most people think, and even if people in this world were utterly different from what they actually are, the dewy-eyed optimism of those who exhort us to fight reveals their naive ignorance of how bad things actually are, how pervasive and, in its various, or specific manifestations, overwhelmingly popular is the agenda of evil. Realistically, there is no basis for optimism, that is, there is no basis for believing that the world can or will become significantly better than it is now. But for a Christian this is not a counsel of despair, because heaven is not of this world, and Jesus Christ's promises are of resurrection for those who follow him. Real Christianity is not a program of socio-political reform. In other words, the cure for despair is not optimism but hope, not group belief in a high probability of amelioration or improvement but the personal certainty of salvation. Of course, the underlying motivations of the fight brigade are often, apparently, selfish or in service to evil. Some are using this rhetoric to make a buck, to build a business, build a cult around themselves, support the party. Others are paid shills or state-employed agents provocateurs. Others are just LARPing as tough guys. But some are, no doubt, sincere but misguided, and they are the focus of the post.